1837, changed surnames, burned documents, life after the reset. Imagine for a moment that you woke up one morning with no memory of the previous 10 years of your life. The people around you hand you a document with a name on it, tell you this is who you are, point to a house and say this is where you live, and ask you to simply carry on. You would have questions, burning, urgent questions about what came before, about who you truly were, about what was taken from you while you slept. Now stretch that thought across an entire civilization. Stretch it across continents. Imagine millions of people waking up in the early to mid-19th century into a world that had been quietly, systematically reorganized around them. Handed new names, new documents, new religions, new borders, and a story about their past that had been written by someone else entirely. That is the central proposition that draws so many researchers into the orbit of what we might call the Great Reset of 1837. A moment not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a quiet, bureaucratic restructuring of the human record that left almost no fingerprints, only shadows. And it is those shadows we are going to follow today. The year 1837 is not chosen arbitrarily by those who investigate this mystery. It is a year that appears again and again as a kind of administrative hinge in the history of Western nations. In England, civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths only became mandatory in 1837. Before that year, the recording of a person's existence was left largely to the church, to parish records that could be lost, destroyed, rewritten, or simply never kept for vast portions of the population. In the same year, Queen Victoria ascended to the throne, beginning what historians frame as a new era of civilization and progress. Across the Atlantic, administrative systems in the United States were being consolidated. Land titles were being redrawn, and the bureaucratic apparatus of the modern state was quietly, efficiently erasing the informal and oral structures that had governed communities for generations. When you begin to map these simultaneous administrative overhauls across multiple nations and empires, the synchronicity becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. But to understand what was reset, we have to first understand what existed before. And for that, we return to the maps. Pull out any European atlas from the 17th or 18th century, and your eye will be drawn almost immediately to a territory of staggering proportion stretching across the northern half of the Eurasian landmass. It is labeled in Latin and in the vernacular of a dozen different languages as Tartaria or Grand Tartari or Tartari. On a 1700 map produced by the French cartographer Guillaume de Lille, this territory encompasses what we now call Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and vast stretches of what is today northern China and Russia. It has internal divisions. There is Muscovite Tartary in the northwest, Chinese Tartary in the east, and independent Tartary, sometimes called Great Tartary, occupying the enormous central land mass, the steppes and river valleys and mountain ranges of the interior continent. The cartographers who drew these maps were not fantasists. They were scholars and geographers working from the reports of merchants, diplomats, and explorers. Jodocus Hondius, One of the most respected mapmakers of the early 17th century, included Tartaria on his maps with the same confidence he placed in the borders of France or Spain. The first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1771, contains an entry on Tartary that describes it as a vast country in the northern parts of Europe and Asia, extending from west to east from the Caspian Sea and the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, and southward to China and India. This is not a footnote. This is a major encyclopedia treating Tartary as a geopolitical reality. And then, within roughly a century, it is gone. Not conquered in any single dramatic war that fills history books. Not dissolved by a revolution with a clear name and a clear date. It simply fades from the maps, absorbed into the expanding territories of the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty. Its name retired, its people reclassified, its history folded into the narratives of the empires that surrounded and superseded it. The question that alternative historians and independent researchers ask, quietly but persistently, is whether that disappearance was entirely natural, or whether it was assisted by a deliberate effort to erase the memory of what Tartaria represented. A unified civilization of enormous geographic and possibly technological reach, whose continued existence in the historical record would complicate the story of progress and empire that the 19th century required. This is where the surnames enter the picture. One of the most striking and often overlooked threads in this investigation is the sudden, systematic adoption of fixed family surnames across Europe and Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries. For most of human history in these regions, naming conventions were fluid and contextual. A man might be known as Ivan the son of Peter, or William the Miller, or simply by a single given name that connected him to his village and his trade. Fixed hereditary surnames, the kind that could be written in a ledger, taxed, conscripted, and controlled, were imposed by centralized states as a tool of administration and surveillance. In the Russian Empire, the formalization of surnames for the peasant class was tied directly to the emancipation reforms of the 19th century. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the imposition of fixed German surnames on Jewish communities was legally mandated in the late 18th century. In Ireland, centuries of Gaelic naming tradition were anglicized and standardized under colonial administration. Across these vastly different cultures and geographies, the pattern is the same. The state arrives, opens a ledger, and says, "From this point forward, you are this name and nothing else. Your children will carry this name. Your history begins here." What was the history that was being left behind? Researchers who follow this thread point to a web of oral traditions, land relationships, spiritual practices, and cultural memories that did not survive the transition into the administrative record. The families who held knowledge of the older world, healers who understood the acoustic properties of stone, builders who knew how to raise a dome that hummed at a specific frequency, astronomers who read the sky through instruments we no longer recognize. These people and their knowledge were not invited into the new ledger. They were reclassified as peasants, as superstitious folk, as uneducated subjects in need of civilizing. Their libraries, where they existed, were absorbed into imperial archives or quietly destroyed. The famous burning of libraries is not merely a metaphor in this narrative. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is the version of this story that made it into our textbooks. But researchers point to dozens of smaller, less celebrated acts of archival destruction throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The systematic dismantling of monastic libraries during the French Revolution, the burning of indigenous records during colonial administration in the Americas, the suppression of local historical traditions across Central Asia during the expansion of the Russian Empire into what had been, on those old maps, the heartland of Tartaria itself. And then there are the buildings. This is where the abstract argument becomes suddenly, viscerally concrete. Walk through almost any city in the Western world, or in the regions that fell under Western or Russian imperial influence in the 19th century, and you will encounter grand neoclassical structures whose origins are officially explained as products of that same Victorian and post-Napoleonic era. City halls with soaring stone columns, train stations that resemble Roman temples, courthouses and universities whose marble interiors suggest a mastery of stonework that, when you stop and think carefully about the timeline, raises serious questions. Consider the pace at which these structures would have had to be built. Consider the tools that were officially available. Horse-drawn carts, hand-operated cranes, workers without power tools, without computer-aided design, without the industrial fabrication methods that allow us to produce precision stonework today. And yet the buildings stand, perfect in their proportions, elaborate in their ornament, often incorporating hydraulic systems, acoustic chambers, and structural geometries that engineers today describe with genuine admiration. One category of these structures deserves special attention in the context of the reset narrative, and that is the Star Fort. These extraordinary geometric fortifications, their footprints laid out in complex stellate patterns of bastions and ravelins, exist on every inhabited continent. Official history attributes them to a military engineering tradition that developed in Europe during the 16th century in response to the development of artillery, a design philosophy called the Trace Italienne. But independent researchers note that the scale and geographic spread of these structures, many of them built in locations with no clear military strategic value, suggests a different purpose or a different origin. Some of them, when seen from above, bear a striking resemblance to symbols found in ancient cosmological and spiritual traditions. Their pentagonal and heptagonal geometries align with mathematical principles that recur in sacred architecture across cultures and centuries. The question these researchers ask is whether some of these structures are not the product of the era to which they are officially attributed, but remnants of an earlier civilization that understood geometry and its relationship to natural energies in ways that our current scientific framework does not fully accommodate. In this interpretive framework, the reset of 1837 and the years surrounding it was not simply an administrative reorganization. It was the final act of a longer process of erasure that had begun decades, perhaps generations, earlier. The mud flood theory, which proposes that a catastrophic deposition of Earth in the early to mid-19th century buried the first floors of countless buildings across Europe and North America, offers one physical mechanism for this kind of sudden civilizational rupture. Walk through any old European city and count the basement windows. Windows that are clearly designed to admit light to a living space but now sit at or below street level, their lower halves buried in earth. The official explanation is that streets were raised over time through ordinary accumulation. But researchers who have looked carefully at the photographic and archival evidence from the mid-19th century point to a pattern that is harder to explain through gradual processes, and an apparently sudden transition in which a generation of grand buildings finds itself half buried, and a new population appears to occupy and repurpose these structures without any clear memory of having built them. This brings us to the orphans. One of the most haunting threads in this entire investigation is the existence of enormous orphanages and foundling hospitals in the major cities of Europe and America throughout the 19th century. Saw institutions housing thousands of children whose origins were, officially, unknown. Independent researchers note that the scale of these institutions goes far beyond what could be explained by ordinary rates of illegitimate birth or parental mortality. Some of them propose that these children were the survivors of the reset, a generation separated from their families, from their languages, from their cultural memory, and placed into institutions where they would be raised with no knowledge of the world that preceded the administrative transformation. They would be given surnames. They would be taught the new history. They would grow up to become the first generation of the post-reset world. People whose entire identity was constructed within the framework of the new order, with no living memory of what came before to contradict it. What came before, in the Tartarian framework, Baum was a civilization of remarkable coherence and sophistication. Not a perfect utopia, not a science fiction empire, but a world in which different cultures across an enormous geographic range shared a common architectural language, a common understanding of natural energies, and a common spiritual framework that expressed itself in the soaring domes and resonant stone chambers of the buildings that still stand, half buried, half forgotten, in our city centers. The great cathedrals of Europe, the grand civic buildings of the American Midwest, the spectacular railway stations of the British imperial world. These structures, in this reading, are not the proud monuments of Victorian and Georgian civilization. They are the inherited furniture of a world that was already ancient when the 19th century claimed them as its own. The great irony of the reset, if it happened as these researchers propose, is that its architects could not destroy the physical evidence. Stone is stubborn. Marble endures. The bones of the old world are still there, in every city, in every town, visible to anyone who stops and really looks. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whether we are willing to see it, to ask why a building in rural Ohio has the same architectural DNA as a structure in St. Petersburg, to ask who really built the palace that your city's history attributes to a handful of craftsmen working with hammers and chisels in a period of just 3 years, to ask why the first decades of the photographic record show a world that looks simultaneously ancient and abandoned, populated by people who seem to be discovering, rather than inhabiting, the grand spaces they occupy. The next time you walk past a grand old building in your city, look down before you look up. Look for the windows that are half below the sidewalk. Look for the columns that seem to descend into the earth rather than rising from it. So look for the dates carved above the doors and ask yourself whether those dates are telling you when the building was constructed or simply when it was claimed. History is not a settled account. It is a living argument, and the most important arguments are the ones that were silenced before they could be finished. We are simply picking up where those silenced voices left off, asking the questions they were not allowed to ask, following the threads that were cut and left dangling in the architecture and the archives and the strange, persistent memory of a world that the official record insists never existed. Look carefully. The evidence has been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 centuries, waiting for someone to look at it with new eyes and ask the simplest, most radical question of all. What if the story we were told was not the whole story?